The word hit the air like a gunshot, silencing the entire yard. "You're fired." David Sutton stood with his broad shoulders squared, his jaw set hard as granite, his dark eyes burning with a fury so controlled it was almost more terrifying than rage. Every hand on the Sutton ranch had stopped what they were doing. The blacksmith's hammer hung suspended in mid-swing. Two stable boys froze near the water trough. Even the horses seemed to hold their breath. Foreman Cleet Hargrove stood a full step back, his face going from red to pale in the span of a heartbeat. He was a big man, thick through the chest and arms, with 20 years of roughened ranch work written into his hands. He had never once heard those words aimed at him, not in all his time working for the Sutton family, not in all the years he'd watched this ranch grow from a modest operation into one of the most respected spreads in all of Larimer County, Colorado. "You can't be serious," Hargrove said. His voice came out lower than he intended, stripped of the authority it usually carried. "I have never been more serious in my life." David stepped closer, and there was something in his measured stillness that made Hargrove instinctively hold his ground only by sheer pride. "Gather your things. You'll have your final wages waiting at the house by sundown. But you will not spend another night under my roof, and you will not set foot on this land again." Over her, Hargrove's lip pulled back in something ugly, and he tilted his head toward the barn where Emma Bancroft had retreated moments earlier, her face pale, her hands shaking, her eyes bright with humiliation she had been fighting hard not to show. "You're throwing away 20 years because of some woman who showed up 3 weeks ago." The silence after those words was absolute. David Sutton moved so fast that no one in the yard could track it properly. He had Hargrove by the collar before the man finished his sentence, pulling him close enough that their faces were inches apart, and when he spoke, his voice was so quiet that only Hargrove could hear every word with perfect, terrible clarity. "Nobody who disrespects her works on this land. That is not a warning. That is not a rule I wrote this morning. That is the only word that matters on this ranch from this moment forward. Now get your bedroll." He released the man with a force that sent Hargrove stumbling backward 2 full steps. Then David turned, and without looking at a single one of the stunned faces watching him, he walked toward the barn, because Emma Bancroft was in there. And she was alone, and that more than anything else in the world was where he needed to be. 3 weeks earlier, on a Tuesday morning in late April of 1884, Emma Bancroft had stepped off the stagecoach at the dusty stop in Fort Collins, Colorado, with a single leather traveling bag, a folded letter of employment, and the careful, composed expression of a woman who had learned long ago not to let her uncertainty show in public. She was 26 years old. She had spent the last 4 years in Denver working as a bookkeeper for a dry goods merchant named Halford Baines, a man whose financial records were as tangled as his personal ethics. When Baines had sold his business and retired to New Mexico without so much as a week's notice to his staff, Emma had found herself standing in the middle of Denver's Blake Street with a month's wages. Excellent references she had written herself because Baines had been too distracted to bother, and the absolute certainty that she needed a fresh start somewhere that felt less like a city trying to become something it wasn't. She had answered the advertisement in the Rocky Mountain News because it was precise, direct, and honest in a way that most advertisements were not. Sought a person of reliable character and demonstrated skill in financial record-keeping to manage accounts, correspondence, and bookkeeping for a working cattle ranch of substantial size. The work is demanding. The position requires residence on the property. References required. Salary fair. Inquire to David Sutton, Sutton Ranch, Larimer County, Colorado. There had been no flowery language, no promises of gentle work or comfortable surroundings. Just a statement of what the job was and what it required. Emma had written back the same way, listing her experience, her capabilities, and 2 references from Denver who could confirm her character. She had not mentioned that she was a woman, not because she intended to deceive, but because the advertisement had not specified otherwise, and she had spent enough time in the world to know that if she announced herself in advance, she was more likely to receive a polite refusal than an interview. The letter of acceptance that came back from Fort Collins 11 days later was brief. Miss Bancroft, your qualifications are satisfactory. Report April 22nd. Stage to Fort Collins, then hire a wagon north to the ranch. I will send a man to meet you at the Fort Collins stop. D. Sutton. He had figured out she was a woman from the Miss. He had hired her anyway. That fact had given Emma more courage than she cared to admit when she stepped off the stagecoach that Tuesday morning and scanned the small crowd of people waiting near the stop for a face she didn't recognize. The man she found watching her was not what she had pictured. She had imagined a ranch owner in his 50s or 60s, someone weathered and practical, someone whose gruffness would be the comfortable, harmless kind that came with age and habit. What she found instead was a man who looked to be somewhere in his mid-30s, dark-haired, lean and broad-shouldered in a way that spoke of work rather than vanity, with a face that was striking in its seriousness. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't particularly welcoming. He held his hat in one hand and watched her step down from the coach with an expression that was purely assessing, the way a man looked at a situation he was still deciding how to handle. Miss Bancroft, he said, and it was not a question. Mr. Sutton, she answered, and it was not an apology. Something shifted in his expression. Not a smile exactly. Something smaller and more careful than that. He stepped forward and took her bag before she had a chance to argue about it, turned toward a wagon waiting at the edge of the road and said, "It's about 40 minutes north. The road is rough in 2 places." "I've traveled rough roads before," Emma said, falling into step beside him. "I expect you have," he said, and that was, remarkably, the end of the introduction. The drive north was quieter than most people would have found comfortable. Emma found it perfectly tolerable. She watched the landscape open up around them, the flat grasslands rolling out toward distant foothills still dusted with late-spring snow, the sky enormous and pale blue in a way that Denver's close buildings never allowed. She asked 2 practical questions about the scope of the financial records she would be managing. David answered both with the same directness the advertisement had promised. By the time the Sutton Ranch came into view, she had a reasonable picture of what the work would involve, and she had decided that regardless of whatever complications might arise from being a woman in a working ranch household, she was going to do this job so well that complications would become irrelevant. The ranch was impressive in a way that was earned rather than showy. The main house was large but not ostentatious, built from timber and stone with a deep front porch that ran the full length of the building. Behind it stood a bunkhouse, a blacksmith shed, 2 large barns, a series of corrals, and beyond everything, open pasture that seemed to stretch all the way to the mountains. There were cattle in the distances, dark shapes moving slowly against the grass. "How many head?" Emma asked. "Close to 1,200, David said. "We're looking to add another 200 by fall." Emma nodded and filed that information away as they pulled into the yard, and the ranch's daily business continued around them with the efficiency of a well-run operation. The housekeeper, a stout woman named Martha Greer, who had cooked and managed the household for the Sutton family since before David had taken over the ranch from his father, met them on the porch with a measuring look aimed directly at Emma, and an air of reserved judgment that Emma recognized immediately and respected. Martha Greer was a woman who made up her mind about people through observation rather than gossip, and she was watching carefully. "Your room is ready," Martha said. "I've put you in the east wing. The office is through the main hall, second door on the left. Mr. Sutton will show you the records after you've settled." "Thank you," Emma said. "I can see the records now if that's convenient." Martha looked at David. David looked at Emma. Then the corner of his mouth shifted almost imperceptibly. "This way," he said. The office was a comfortable room with a large desk, shelves of ledgers and correspondence files, a wood-burning stove that had been left banked low against the late April chill, and a window that looked out over the east pasture. David set her bag just inside the door, crossed to the desk, and opened the bottom drawer, pulling out a leather-bound ledger that was, as Emma discovered when she took it from him and opened it, a record of genuine competence buried under a year of accumulated disorder. "Your last bookkeeper," Emma said, turning pages carefully. "Left in November, family matter." David leaned against the desk edge with his arms folded. "I've been managing it since then." Emma turned another page and did not say what she was thinking, which was that managing it was a generous description of what had happened to these records between November and April. What she said instead was, "I'll need a week to fully assess what's here and build a current picture. After that, I can give you an accurate accounting of where the finances stand." "Take what you need," David said. "If you need anything from me, I'm usually available at the end of the day. I'm in the field or the barns most of the morning and afternoon." "I'll make notes as I go," Emma said, and sat down at the desk and opened the ledger to the first disordered page. David stood where he was for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. Then he pushed off the desk and walked out of the office, and Emma heard his boots on the floor and then the front door and then the yard, and she was already pulling the next ledger from the shelf. She was aware, in the practical corner of her mind that cataloged such things without sentimentality, that David Sutton was a man who could hold a woman's attention without particularly trying. She was also aware that this was irrelevant. She had a job to do. She intended to do it. Cleet Hargrove made his opinion of her known inside the first 48 hours. He didn't say anything directly offensive at first. He was too practiced for that, too comfortable in his authority on the ranch to bother with outright hostility when condescension would do the same work more efficiently. He would appear in the office doorway while Emma was working and ask questions that were really statements, framed to remind her that he had been running the operational side of this ranch for 2 decades, and her position was administrative, and therefore beneath notice. He would reference decisions and expenditures in front of the ranch hands with a slightly elevated voice, as though he wanted to be certain Emma heard that the foreman's authority on this land was a settled and inarguable thing. Emma documented his interference in her working notes because she was methodical, and because she had encountered men like Hargrove before in every professional setting she had ever occupied. She did not complain to David about it. She did not give Hargrove the reaction he was looking for, which was either visible intimidation or visible frustration. She simply continued working, and she continued being very, very good at her job. It was Martha Greer who told her, on her 4th evening at the ranch, what the financial records had already begun to suggest. Emma had come to the kitchen after the dinner hour when the house had settled into its quieter rhythms, to heat water for tea and to think through the numbers she had been examining all day. Martha was still at the kitchen table, mending something with the steady concentration of a woman who did nothing by halves. "You found something in those books," Martha said, without looking up from her work. Emma settled into the chair across from her. "I've found a pattern," she said carefully. "I'd rather be certain before I say more." Martha set down her mending and looked at Emma with those steady, measuring eyes. "Hargrove has been drawing from the supply accounts," she said quietly. Not dramatically. Nothing anyone would notice who wasn't looking very closely. "A few dollars here, a credit that doesn't quite balance there. I've suspected it for months. I don't have the numbers to prove it." Emma wrapped both hands around her teacup. "I do," she said. Martha held her gaze. "You need to be careful, Miss Bancroft. Cleet Hargrove has been the authority on this land for a long time. The hands trust him. He knows where everything is, how everything runs. Mr. Sutton has always trusted him because he trusted Mr. Sutton's father before him." "How much?" Emma asked simply. Martha was quiet for a moment. "More than anyone realizes," she said. "And it's been going on longer than this past year." Emma nodded slowly. She thanked Martha for the tea and went back to the office, where she lit the lamp and worked for 3 more hours, tracing lines through ledgers that went back 4 years, building a picture that was methodical and irrefutable, and when she had finished sketching it out in her careful hand on a fresh sheet of paper, genuinely alarming. Hargrove had been taking money from the Sutton Ranch for at least 3 years. The amounts varied, always kept small enough to blur beneath the surface of busy accounts, always attached to legitimate line items in a way that made them look like rounding errors or minor overages rather than theft. But accumulated over 3 years, they were not minor. They were not errors. They amounted to a sum that made Emma sit very still in her chair for a long moment, the lamp burning steadily beside her, the night outside the window full of spring crickets and distant cattle sounds. She thought about what Martha had said. She thought about the hidden motive behind Hargrove's visible condescension, the way it served both to undermine her credibility before she found anything, and to remind the entire ranch that his authority was unquestionable. She thought about the dark past those numbers represented, years of quiet, confident betrayal by a man who had apparently decided that his long service entitled him to something additional. She thought about David Sutton, who had trusted this man his entire adult life. She was still thinking about all of this when she heard boots on the porch. The front door opened, and she heard them cross the hall, and then David appeared in the office doorway. He had clearly been in the barn late. There was a faint smell of horses and fresh hay about him, and his collar was open at the throat against the warmth of the work he'd been doing. He looked at her sitting at the lamplit desk at close to 11 o'clock at night with a sheet of paper in her hand and the ledgers spread around her, and he stepped fully into the room. "You found something," he said. She had not planned to tell him tonight. She had planned to verify every number one more time in the morning, before she brought him anything. But there was something in his face, something in the directness of those dark eyes, that made her realize that delaying this conversation by 12 hours to give herself the comfort of one more review was not about the numbers. It was about the fear of being the person who brought this information to this man's door. Emma Bancroft was not in the habit of letting fear make her decisions. She set the paper on the desk and turned it to face him and said, "Sit down, Mr. Sutton." He sat. He read. He was very still while he read, with the controlled, absolute stillness she was beginning to recognize as his particular version of strong feeling. When he finished, he looked up at her. "How certain are you?" he said. "Completely," she said. "I will verify every number once more tomorrow morning if you want me to, but I've traced it through 4 ledgers. The pattern is not accidental." He sat back. He looked at the paper for a long moment. Then he said something she did not expect. "How long did it take you to find this?" Emma considered. 6 days, she said, "but I had the ledgers in front of me for that purpose. If I hadn't been looking specifically, it might have taken longer." He knew that, David said quietly. He knew that a new bookkeeper would be looking closely. "Yes," Emma said. "Which is why he was working very hard to convince me that my role here was minor and my authority was limited. He needed to know whether I was a threat before I found anything." David was quiet for a long time. The lamp flickered once in a draft from somewhere. Outside, a horse moved in the near paddock. When he finally spoke, his voice was level, but there was something beneath it that Emma could hear very clearly. "I gave that man everything my father would have given him," he said. "He ate at this table. He worked beside me through 2 hard winters. I defended him twice to men who said he couldn't be trusted." A pause. "I trusted him." "I know," Emma said quietly. "He looked me in the face every single day knowing what he was doing." "Yes." David stood. He folded the paper she had made and placed it inside his coat. He looked at her for a moment with something in his expression that was complicated and unguarded, and she realized, grateful in a way that the word grateful didn't adequately describe. "Thank you, Miss Bancroft," he said. "I'll handle it in the morning." He turned to go. She said, without particularly planning to, "Mr. Sutton, be careful. He will turn whatever authority he has with the hands against you if he can. He'll call it a misunderstanding. He'll suggest the numbers were errors before your bookkeeper arrived, or even that they appeared in the records after." David stopped in the doorway. He looked back at her. "I know how men like that fight," he said, "but thank you for saying it." He left. Emma sat at the desk for a while longer in the quiet of the lamplight, and she was aware that her heart was beating slightly faster than usual, which she attributed entirely to the stress of the conversation and absolutely nothing else. In the morning, David confronted Hargrove privately before the day's work began. Emma was in the office with the door slightly ajar, not to eavesdrop, but because the early morning air was cold and she was waiting for the stove to fully heat the room. She heard enough. Hargrove had done exactly what she predicted. He had called it a misunderstanding. He had suggested that the records were poorly kept before Emma arrived, that any imbalances were the previous bookkeeper's doing. He had said, with smooth and practiced ease, that a woman who had been on the property for less than a week was hardly a reliable source for accusations against a man with 20 years of proven service. Emma heard David's response very clearly. "I've checked the numbers myself. They are exactly what she found, and I will be checking the records you've submitted to the county office for the past 3 years as well." The conversation from that point had deteriorated. Hargrove had escalated. His voice had risen. He had moved from professional argument to something personal, something that involved Emma's presence on the ranch and the role she was playing and what it meant about David's judgment. He had said things that were not said with any concern for her dignity or her right to be treated as a professional. He had said them loudly, in a voice that carried, because he had understood that the hands were within earshot and he was making a calculation about loyalty. That was when David had walked out of the room with him. That was when the yard had gone quiet. That was when Emma, standing at the office window, had watched what happened next with her hand pressed flat against her sternum, her heart doing something complicated and difficult that she would examine later when she had more privacy for it. That was the moment. The firing. The words that now echoed over the suddenly silent ranch. "Nobody who disrespects her works on this land." Emma stood in the barn behind a stall partition she had retreated to when the confrontation moved into the yard, her back against the solid old wood, her breathing careful. She heard footsteps crossing the barn floor toward her, and she knew the sound of those boots already after only 3 weeks, which was a fact she filed away with everything else she was not examining yet. David came around the partition and stopped when he saw her. She was standing straight, her hands folded in front of her, her expression as composed as she could make it. But her eyes, she knew, were bright. She couldn't quite control that. "He's gone," David said quietly. "I heard," she said. He studied her face for a moment. "Are you all right?" Something about the directness of the question, the simple way it cut through everything else, made the composure she had been holding very carefully waver for just a second. She pressed it back into place. "I'm perfectly fine," she said. "You're not," he said, but not unkindly. "You don't have to be." What he said in there was not acceptable. "I've heard worse," Emma said. "That is not a virtue I'm claiming, it's just the truth." David was quiet for a moment. The barn around them smelled of hay and leather, and the particular warm animal peace that only large barns carry. A shaft of morning light came through a high window and crossed the straw-covered floor between them. "I know it is," he said finally. "That doesn't make it right." Emma looked at him steadily. "No," she agreed, "it doesn't. I should have moved sooner," he said. "I saw the way he was treating you from the first day. I should have said something then." "You had no cause yet," Emma said. "And speaking before there was cause would have made my position on this ranch more difficult, not less. You made the right call." He looked at her for a moment as though she had said something slightly surprising. Then he said, with a different quality to his voice, something quieter, "You're defending my choices to me." "I'm being accurate about them," Emma said. "There's a difference." He almost smiled. It was just the shadow of it, the slight shift in his expression, but she caught it and it did something warm and inconvenient to her chest. "Come on," he said, turning toward the barn door. "Martha will have breakfast ready." "I should get back to the accounts," Emma said. "The accounts will keep 20 minutes, David said, and walked out into the morning sunlight, and after a moment Emma followed him. The days that followed were different from the ones before them. With Hargrove gone, the ranch adjusted to a new configuration, and Emma was surprised by how quickly that adjustment happened. Two of the senior hands, a quiet man named Tom Briggs, and a young wrangler named Pete Calloway, who couldn't have been more than 22, stepped into the operational coordination that Hargrove had managed, and they did it with a straightforwardness that made the transition smoother than Emma had expected. She suspected that Hargrove's authority, while long established, had not been as universally beloved as he had implied. Martha Greer, who had been cautiously professional toward Emma since her arrival, shifted into something warmer after the morning in the barn. She began saving Emma a plate on the nights when Emma worked late, and she had a way of appearing with coffee at exactly the moments when Emma's concentration was flagging, which Emma found both touching and slightly uncanny. Emma continued building the financial picture of the ranch with meticulous care. She wrote to the county record's office in Fort Collins and, through a careful professional correspondence, began the process of identifying what discrepancies existed in the public records that Hargrove had submitted. She drafted a formal accounting of the theft that was precise enough to hold up against legal challenge. She did not discuss any of this with David until she had every piece verified and documented, because she had learned from the Baines situation that incomplete information presented too early was worse than no information at all. She presented the full accounting to David on a Thursday afternoon in the second week after Hargrove's dismissal. He read it in silence at his desk, while Emma sat in the chair across from him and waited. When he finished, he set it down and looked out the window for a long moment. "This is enough to press charges," he said. "Yes," Emma said. "The documentation is complete. Whether you choose to pursue it legally or simply ensure the information is on record is your decision." "I'll speak to the county attorney," David said. "I want it on record." He paused. "And I want him to know that this came from accurate accounting, that what he called unreliable produced this." There was something in how he said the last sentence that made Emma realize he was angry in a way that went beyond the money. It was the broader betrayal he was working through, the hidden motive behind all those years of loyal-seeming service, the trap of misplaced trust. And beneath that, she sensed, something about what Hargrove had said about Emma herself. About the way he had tried to use her to escape accountability. "He was banking on the likelihood that your trust in me would be insufficient," Emma said carefully, "that a woman 3 weeks on the property would not be believed over a man with 20 years of established authority." David looked at her directly. "I was not going to let that stand." "I know," Emma said quietly. "You didn't." They looked at each other for a moment across the desk. Then David cleared his throat and picked up the accounting document and said, "I'll ride to Fort Collins tomorrow morning. Will you be all right here?" "I have been all right here when you're in the field all day," Emma pointed out. "Fort Collins is not qualitatively different." "No," he said, and this time the almost smile was more pronounced, and Emma had to look at the ledger on her lap to give herself something useful to focus on. She was falling in love with him. She had known it for several days in the way that one knows something one has been deliberately not examining. The knowing had come quietly, in the accumulated details of the man rather than any single dramatic moment. The way he spoke to his horses with a low, patient voice that was nothing like the economy of his speech with people. The way he read the county newspaper every evening on the porch with the concentration of a man who believed staying informed was a responsibility. The way he had looked at her across that barn in the morning light after Hargrove's dismissal, not with pity or protectiveness, but with a kind of plain, honest recognition that she found more moving than either. She was also quite certain that she was going to be very sensible about it, because David Sutton was her employer, and she had come to this ranch to do a job, and she was going to do that job and not complicate it with feelings she had no evidence were shared. This sensible resolution lasted until the following Saturday evening. David had returned from Fort Collins the previous day with the county attorney's confirmation that charges would be filed against Hargrove, and that the documentation Emma had compiled was exactly what was needed. He had told her this with the same economy of expression he brought to everything, but she had seen the relief in him, the lightening of something he had been carrying since the morning in the barn, and she had been glad. Saturday evenings on the Sutton ranch, she had discovered, had a particular rhythm. The hands gathered in the bunkhouse after supper. Martha retired early. The house settled into a quiet that was different from the weekday quiet, softer and less purposeful. David sometimes played chess against himself in the sitting room, which Emma had found both charming and slightly ridiculous and had taken to challenging him on. They were well matched. He was more aggressive. She was more patient. Their games tended to be long and absorbed and punctuated by longer silences than conversation, which suited both of them. This particular Saturday, Emma had been about to suggest a game when she came through the hall and found David standing on the front porch with his hands on the railing, looking out at the evening sky. The sun was going down behind the mountains in a blaze of orange and deep rose, and the ranch lay in the long blue shadow of early dusk, peaceful and settled and very beautiful. Emma stopped in the doorway, not wanting to interrupt whatever he was in. Then he said without turning, "I used to think this view could fix anything." She stepped out onto the porch and stood beside him. The air smelled of sage and cooling grass. "Can't it?" she asked. "Some things it can't reach," he said. She waited. "I've been thinking about my father," he said. "He hired Hargrove. He trusted him completely. If my father had known what he was doing to this place, to this land my father built his whole life around." He stopped. "It's the betrayal that won't settle. The money is replaceable. The years of work, the decisions I made based on wrong information he gave me, those I can correct." But knowing he looked my father in the face while he was stealing from him. He shook his head once, a small, tight motion. Emma was quiet for a moment. "I'm sorry," she said. "Not for finding it. I don't regret finding it, but I'm sorry for the shape of it, for what it costs you beyond the accounting." He turned and looked at her, and in the evening light his face was open in a way she hadn't seen before, the usual controlled guardedness set aside by something genuine and unguarded. "You are not what I expected," he said. "What did you expect?" she asked, keeping her voice even. "I'm not certain," he said. "Someone more careful, perhaps, more contained. I expected competence. I got something else entirely along with it." Emma held his gaze. "Something else," she repeated carefully. "Something that has made this ranch better since the day you arrived," he said. "Not just the accounts, although the accounts." He stopped and something shifted in his expression, something that looked very much like a man deciding to say the thing he had been not saying. "I'm not good at this," he said, "at saying what I mean in a context that isn't practical." "I've noticed," Emma said gently. "I would like to be better at it," he said, "if you were willing to be patient with the learning curve." She was very still. Her heart was doing the thing it had been doing more and more frequently in his presence, the warm, full thing that she had been resolutely categorizing as irrelevant. "That is a very oblique sentence, Mr. Sutton," she said. "David," he said. "My name is David. You've been calling me Mr. Sutton for 3 weeks and I have been finding it increasingly." He stopped again. "Increasingly what?" she asked, and her voice was softer than she meant it to be. "Frustrating," he said. "Because it is accurate and appropriate, and I find that I don't want accurate and appropriate from you anymore." Emma took a slow breath of the sage-scented evening air. "David," she said, and the word settled between them with a weight that made them both very still. "What is it that you do want?" He looked at her for a long time. The last light of the sunset was very beautiful. Somewhere in the distance an owl called once and went quiet. "I want to take you for a ride tomorrow morning," he said. "Out to the east pasture where the creek runs. I want to show you something I haven't shown anyone in a long time." A pause. "And I want you to call me David every time." Emma felt the smile come before she could decide about it. "Yes," she said simply, "to both of those things." He looked at her with that almost smile that was becoming more present every day, and the evening light was very warm on both of them. And Martha, who Emma discovered later had been watching from the hall window with enormous and entirely unsubtle satisfaction, retreated back to the kitchen with the expression of a woman whose judgment had been thoroughly vindicated. The ride to the east pasture the following morning was different from the first week's professional distances. They rode side by side along a track that wound through long grass beginning to green with late spring warmth, the mountains visible to the west in the morning clarity, the sky that impossible Colorado blue that Emma had been privately amazed by since her arrival. David rode a dark bay gelding with easy confidence, and Emma was on a gray mare from the ranch's saddle string that moved with a pleasant, willing temperament. He showed her the creek where it ran clear and quick over rounded stones through a stand of cottonwood trees, their leaves just coming in, pale green and shivering in the light breeze. He showed her a place where the bank opened into a wide flat area where the cattle came to water in the afternoons. He showed her, without quite putting it into words, how much he loved this land, how deep the attachment ran in him, in the way he moved through it and looked at it, in the particular quality of his attention when he pointed something out. "Your father built this," Emma said, looking out over the pasture from the creek bank. "Bought the land, built everything on it. 23 years of work." He was standing beside her, not quite touching. "He came out from Ohio with my mother in 1861. She died when I was 12. He ran this place alone after that, with the hands and Martha." "Martha was here that long," Emma said, surprised. "She came with my mother," David said. "She's been here longer than me in a sense." Emma thought about that, about what kind of loyalty that was and what kind of household it made and what David's life had looked like growing up in it, a boy becoming a man surrounded by the work ethic of a grieving father and the steady care of a woman who had loved his mother. "That's why you trust loyalty so deeply," she said quietly. "And why Hargrove's betrayal cost what it did." He looked at her with something very direct in his expression. "You understand a great deal," he said, "for someone who's only been here 3 weeks." "I pay attention," Emma said simply. "You do," he said. "I've noticed." He was quiet for a moment. "Emma." Her name in his mouth was different from Miss Bancroft, warmer and more immediate, and she was aware, something she would be very happy to hear for a long time. "Yes," she said. "I am not practiced in the kind of honesty this requires," he said, looking at the creek rather than her. "I have been running this ranch and this business and everything attached to it since I was 21 years old, and I have been very good at the practical kind of honesty. The kind that is about facts and numbers and decisions. The other kind." He stopped. "The kind about feelings," Emma offered. "Yes." He said it with such visible reluctance to use the word that she had to press her lips together to keep from smiling. "That kind, I haven't had much occasion for it." He finally looked at her. "I have had a great deal of occasion for it since you arrived." Emma met his gaze steadily, her heart very full. "As have I," she said, "and I am generally better at the practical kind as well." "Then we're both out of our depth," he said. "Together," she said, "which is considerably better than separately." His expression shifted into something that was fully a smile this time, not the shadow of one, not the almost of one, but a real warm smile that changed his whole face and made her understand what people meant when they talked about falling in love with a smile. "Yes," he said, "it is." He offered her his hand to help her down from the bank where she'd stepped to see the water closer, and when his hand closed over hers, she held it a moment longer than strictly necessary, and he let her, and neither of them said anything about it, and it was one of the most communicative moments Emma had experienced in her life. They rode back to the ranch in the gold of late morning, and if the hands noticed something different in the way the ranch owner and the bookkeeper moved through the yard together, Tom Briggs had the good sense to keep his observation to himself, and Pete Calloway was too young and too obviously pleased by the entire situation to be a problem. The weeks that followed had the quality of something being built carefully, with the attention and the patience that good building requires. David and Emma spent time together in the evenings with a naturalness that grew from their shared interest in the ranch's health and their comfortable intellectual equality, and they found that the transition from professional respect to genuine affection was not the complicated leap they had both privately expected. It was a gradual deepening, a warmth that increased by degrees, that felt more like something being discovered than something being constructed. He began coming to the office in the late afternoons, ostensibly to review figures with her, and the figures did get reviewed, but they also talked about the ranch and its future, about what Emma had learned from the Baines situation in Denver and what she had carried forward from it, about David's plans to expand the cattle operation, and whether the finances supported the timeline he was considering, about books, because Emma had brought 4 novels in her single traveling bag and David had a shelf of them in the sitting room that he had clearly read more than once. About Emma's family, her parents both gone, her younger sister married and settled in Kansas City, the particular geography of a life lived mostly independently. About David's father more than once, because David was still working through the layers of what Hargrove's betrayal meant for the legacy of a man who had trusted the wrong person. Emma listened with the full quality of attention she brought to everything she considered important, and David began to understand by degrees that being listened to in that particular way was something he had not known he was missing. He kissed her for the first time in the office, of all places, on a rainy June evening when they had been going over the expense projections for the fall cattle purchase, and she had caught a calculation error in his penciled figures and corrected it so quickly that he had looked up at her with such unguarded admiration that something shifted irrevocably between them. "You see things no one else catches," he said, and his voice was different in the quiet rain sound of the room. Emma looked up from the figures and found him much closer than she had realized, and the space between them was only a question. She closed that space herself, which she knew later would have amused him if he had told her he'd been planning to do it himself. Their mouths met quietly and carefully at first, then with a warmth that neither of them rushed because neither of them had any interest in rushing it. When they separated, Emma kept her eyes closed for one more second, storing the moment. "I've been thinking about doing that since approximately the 3rd day," she admitted. "The creek," he said, "when you called me David the first time." She opened her eyes. "That was the moment for you." "That was the moment," he confirmed, with a certainty that made her laugh, quietly and delightedly, which made him smile the smile she had been cataloging as her favorite. And they sat in the lamplit office in the June rain and looked at each other with the uncomplicated happiness of people who have found something they had begun to suspect might not exist. The summer moved forward with the ranch's particular rhythms, and Emma moved with them, no longer a new arrival but a presence that had woven itself into the functioning of the place. She managed the accounts with the thoroughness she had promised and an increasingly comprehensive understanding of how the ranch's operations, its seasonal cycles, its relationships with buyers and suppliers and neighboring landowners, all connected to the financial picture. She identified 2 additional irregularities in historical records, both smaller than Hargrove's systematic theft, and addressed them with the county office through the proper channels. She also became, in the way of someone who is genuinely present in a place and genuinely pays attention, a resource for the hands in a way that had nothing to do with accounting. Tom Briggs came to her about a letter he needed written to a family member in Missouri, because his own writing was slow and uncertain, and Emma wrote it for him without comment and asked him to tell her what he wanted to say rather than how he thought it should sound. And the letter, when it was finished, sounded exactly like the man she had come to know well enough in 3 months to recognize. Pete Calloway, who was saving toward a piece of land of his own and had no particular system for it, left their conversation with a small ledger book and a simple tracking system that Emma had explained in 15 minutes, and he used it with the dedication of a recent convert. Martha Greer, who had been watching all of this with the quiet satisfaction of a woman who trusted her own judgment, said to Emma one evening in early August while they were shelling peas on the back porch, "You're good for this ranch." Emma glanced at her. "The accounting is in reasonable shape now," she said. Martha gave her a look of magnificent patience. "I don't mean the accounting, child." Emma looked down at the peas in her lap. "Martha, "I'm not embarrassing you," Martha said. "I'm telling you something I want you to hear clearly. This house has been running on efficiency and competence and grief for a long time. What it needs is what it's getting. Don't let practicality talk you out of it." Emma was quiet for a moment. "I haven't been letting it," she said. "Good," Martha said firmly, and resumed shelling peas with the air of a woman who had said exactly what she meant to say. David asked her, on a warm August evening when the ranch was in its summer fullness, and the mountains were visible all the way to the snowline in the long evening light, whether she had thought about staying permanently. They were on the porch, in the chairs they had made their own over the summer, the chess board between them, though neither of them was looking at it. The question arrived without preamble because David had long since stopped managing the approach to things he needed to say to her. Emma looked at him. "In what capacity?" she said, because she needed to hear him say it plainly and she suspected he knew that. "In every capacity," he said. "As the person who manages these accounts and always will. As the person who has this chair on this porch. As my wife, Emma, if you're willing." He held her gaze with the steady, dark-eyed directness that was so essentially him. "I am not good at the oblique approach on things that matter. You know that by now." "I do know that," she said. "It's one of the things I love about you." Something in his expression was very still. "You love me," he said, as though confirming the calculation. "David," she said with gentle exasperation, "I have loved you since approximately the 3rd week of June, and I have been considerably less discreet about it than you apparently have." "I've been discreet," he said, looking genuinely bewildered. "You look at me like I'm the best thing in any room you've ever been in," Emma said. "That is not discreet." He was quiet for a second. Then he said, "I didn't know it showed." "It shows," she said warmly. "I love you. Yes, I will marry you. And yes, I intend to keep these accounts in impeccable order regardless of what else I'm doing." He reached across the chessboard and took her hand and held it with the same certainty he brought to everything he committed to. And Emma thought, in the warm August dusk, with the mountains going rose and gold behind the foothills, that she had answered an advertisement in a newspaper 14 years into her future, and the road it had taken her down was the most consequential journey she had ever made. They were married in Fort Collins in September of 1884 at the county courthouse, with Martha Greer and Tom Briggs as witnesses, and then again in a small church ceremony 2 weeks later, when Martha declared that a courthouse registry was not a wedding, and organized the whole thing herself with the authority of a woman who had been waiting 15 years to plan this man's happiness. Emma wore a dress she had ordered from a dressmaker in Fort Collins, a pale ivory wool with a fitted bodice and simple clean lines that suited her practicality and her sense of occasion equally. David, in a dark suit she had never seen him wear before and suspected was new, looked at her walking toward him with an expression she would carry for the rest of her life. Not the dramatic, overwhelmed look of popular illustration. Something quieter and more permanent, like a man who has found the thing that will organize the rest of everything. They came home to the ranch that had already been home for 6 months, to Martha's dinner and the hands' genuinely warm congratulations, and the evening porch light, and the long, slow luxury of no longer categorizing anything. The winter of 1884 to 1885 was hard in Larimer County. Cold came early and deep, and by December the ranch was operating in conditions that tested everything about it. Emma managed the supply accounts with particular care, because winter was when errors became dangerous, when a miscalculated hay reserve or an underestimated wood requirement became not just an inconvenience but a genuine problem. She worked alongside David in the way she had always worked alongside him, as a genuine partner in the operation, not in the physical outdoor labor that required different experience and different equipment, but in the thinking and planning and record-keeping that determined whether the physical labor was working in the right direction. They talked every evening. This was not a small thing. Emma had known marriages that ran on habit and silence, in which two people shared a house and a table and almost nothing else. She had watched her parents' marriage, which had been warm but often distracted, and her sister Clara's marriage, which was fond and somewhat chaotic. She had not known what to expect of her own, and what she found was something she had no complete vocabulary for. A partnership that was comfortable and engaging and funny and serious and intimate in the particular way of two people who have chosen to know each other rather than simply to be near each other. David was not an effusive man by nature. He did not produce romantic declarations with any frequency, but he was present in a way that Emma found worth far more than declarations. When she was working late, there was always a lamp lit in the hall so she didn't come out to darkness. When she was thinking through something that was troubling her, he would wait through her silence with a patience that was entirely specific to her. When she was right about something he had doubted, he said so directly and without qualification. He also made her laugh, which she had not expected. The humor was dry and infrequent, which made it more effective when it appeared. He had a way of observing the particular small absurdities of ranch life, the endless negotiations with suppliers, the opinions of neighboring ranchers on subjects far outside their expertise, the consistent dignity of the horses contrasted with the consistent indignity of the cattle. That was so precise it caught her off guard every time. By the following spring, Emma knew she was expecting their first child. She told David on a Sunday morning, sitting at the kitchen table with coffee and the county paper, with the directness she brought to all information. He set down the paper and looked at her for a moment with that very still expression that she had learned meant he was feeling something large and not yet sure how to hold it. Then he got up from his chair and came to her and held her face in his hands, and what he said was quiet and not elaborate and was one of the most perfect things she had ever heard. "We'll take good care of each other," he said. "All three of us." Thomas Sutton was born in November of 1885. A healthy, loud-voiced boy who immediately demonstrated a personality so thoroughly his own that Emma and David both spent the first weeks of his life in a state of delighted bewilderment. He had David's dark eyes and Emma's capacity for sustained focus, applied primarily, in his early months, to the problem of making his needs known with maximum efficiency. Martha, who had wept with absolute composure at his birth, and then immediately taken charge of everything with the authority of long practice, adored him with a depth that reorganized the entire household. Tom Briggs, upon first seeing the baby, removed his hat and stood very straight and said, "Well, he looks like someone who means business," which was so accurate that Emma had laughed until she cried, to David's barely contained amusement. The ranch continued to grow. Emma managed the expansion accounts through the winter and spring of 1886 with the same systematic care she brought to everything, and the pattern of her work by now had a confidence in it that came from deep familiarity, not just with the numbers but with the land and the operation, and the rhythms that drove both. She knew the seasonal patterns of expenditure well enough to anticipate them by months, well enough to plan for opportunities that had once passed unnoticed, because no one had been tracking the conditions that produced them. She also continued the practice she had established of helping the hands with correspondence and the occasional practical document, and had expanded this quietly over time into a kind of informal education arrangement with Pete Calloway and two of the newer hands, neither of whom could read particularly well, who came to the office one morning a week and left with somewhat better skills each time. David had found her in the middle of one of these sessions and stood in the doorway watching for a moment before she noticed him, and the expression on his face when she looked up had the same quality as the one he'd had in the church, organizing everything around it. "You know," he said afterward, "that you don't have to do that." "I know," Emma said. "That's why I do it." He shook his head slowly, not in objection but in something that looked remarkably like wonder. "You are extraordinary," he said, with the same certainty he brought to all factual statements. "I'm practical," Emma said. "You are practical in extraordinary ways," he said, which was, she decided, precisely the right thing to say. The Hargrove matter was resolved in the spring of 1886, when the county court found in the ranch's favor. Hargrove had not been able to produce an alternative explanation for the discrepancies in the records, and Emma's documentation was exactly what she had said it was: complete, accurate, and irrefutable. He was required to make restitution over a 5-year period, a sum that, while significant, would not ruin him if he worked, which was more than David had initially felt inclined toward, but which Emma had gently argued was the more sustainable resolution for everyone involved. "Why does that concern you?" David had asked, not combatively but genuinely curious. "Because I have seen what happens when men are ruined completely," Emma said quietly. "They become dangerous in ways they weren't before. A man making restitution has a direction to walk toward. A man with nothing left has nothing to lose." David had considered this for a longer time than most considerations took him. "That's wiser than the way I was thinking," he said. "You were thinking about justice," Emma said. "That's not wrong. I'm thinking about consequences. Both are necessary." "Yes," he said. "They are." He had looked at her with that full, specific attention. "I want to keep making decisions with you," he said. "Not just about the ranch, everything." Emma had taken his hand across the desk. "That is exactly what you're going to do," she said. By the summer of 1887, Thomas was walking with the determined enthusiasm of a child who had somewhere very important to be at all times, and Emma was expecting again. This second pregnancy was different from the first, somewhat more demanding physically, and there were 2 weeks in early autumn when Emma found herself frustrated by the enforced slowing of her pace in a way she couldn't quite reason with herself out of. She was not a person who was comfortable with limitation, and the limitations were real and needed to be respected, but the respecting of them was not, in those particular weeks, entirely peaceful. David managed this with a care that Emma recognized and was grateful for, which was the care of someone who understood that what she needed was not to be told to rest, but to have her work redistributed in a way that kept her engaged without overtaxing her. He brought the account books to wherever she was comfortable sitting, rather than expecting her to come to the office. He consulted her on every decision rather than making them alone and reporting back, because he understood that being excluded from decisions was a different kind of exhaustion than the physical one. He sat with her in the evenings and read aloud from the newspapers when she was too tired to read herself but too restless for silence. He also, on a Tuesday morning when Emma had admitted in the particular honesty of early exhaustion that she was frightened, held her for a long time without saying anything that wasn't necessary, and what he said when he did speak was, "I'm here. I'm not going anywhere from you. You are going to be all right." She believed him absolutely. Catherine Sutton was born in February of 1888, loud and pink and so thoroughly present from her first moment that she seemed less like a new arrival than a person who had been somewhere else and had finally made it to where she was supposed to be. Thomas, 2 years old and deeply invested in his own assessment of every situation, examined his sister with great seriousness and then announced, to no one in particular, "She's very loud," which was accurate. Martha wept with the same composure as before, and then immediately took charge of everything, also as before. Pete Calloway, who was by now running a small piece of his own land on the eastern side of the county that Emma had helped him secure through careful financial planning, came to see the baby on a Sunday and sat in the kitchen with the same reverence he brought to things he considered genuinely important. Tom Briggs held the baby with the careful, completely focused attention of a man who understood that he was holding something of tremendous consequence, and when he handed her back he said, "She looks like someone who knows exactly what she wants," which was, again, so accurate that Emma laughed and David, holding his daughter, smiled his real smile, the one that had been happening with increasing frequency over the 3.5 years since an August evening on the porch. The ranch in 1888 was a different operation from the one Emma had arrived at 4 years earlier. Not in its essential character, which was still the practical, hard-working, quality-driven operation that David's father had built and David had expanded, but in its scope and its financial stability and the confidence with which it moved through both good seasons and difficult ones. The accounts were in a condition that Emma could honestly describe as excellent, a genuine reserve for hard winters, planned investment in improvements that were paced against actual income, relationships with buyers and suppliers that were documented and reliable and regularly reviewed. Emma had also, over those 4 years, developed a reputation in the broader county community as someone worth consulting on financial matters, and she received occasional requests from neighboring ranches and from individuals in Fort Collins for advice or assistance with accounts. She took on a small number of these, selectively and carefully, because she was clear about what she could manage well and had no interest in managing things poorly. The income from this work she added to a separate account she had established with David's full knowledge and support, which she thought of as the household's margin for the unexpected. She and David had settled, by the late 1880s, into the particular deepened form of love that comes from years of real partnership and real knowledge of another person. The romantic feeling was not replaced by routine. It was enriched by it, given depth by the understanding of each other that only time and genuine attention produce. Emma found, at 30 years old, with 2 children and a thriving ranch, and a man she knew as well as she knew herself, that she was in possession of a happiness she had not precisely imagined when she answered that advertisement in 1884, because she had not known to imagine it in these exact dimensions. She had known that she wanted work that mattered and a life that was her own. She had not quite known to expect the particular quality of being loved by someone who did it as David did, without performance and without condition, and with the full weight of his considerable character behind it. In the spring of 1889, Emma received a letter from her sister Clara in Kansas City. Clara wrote once a season, long, cheerful letters full of the details of her husband William's dry goods business and the adventures of her 3 daughters, and Emma always read them with the warm affection of someone who loves a person thoroughly despite the distance between them. This letter was different. This letter was shorter and more strained and was, between the lines that Clara's careful optimism was working hard to maintain, a letter about difficulty. William's business had hit a serious obstacle, a partnership that had gone wrong and left him exposed to a debt that was threatening the stability of everything they had built. Emma read the letter twice. Then she brought it to David. He read it and said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "What do you want to do?" Emma considered. "I want to write back with a detailed set of questions about the specific nature of the debt and the partnership structure," she said. "Before I know more precisely what the situation is, I don't want to offer solutions that might not fit it." "And if the situation is what the letter implies it might be," David said. Emma met his eyes. "Then I want to help them," she said, "directly if we can manage it." "We can manage it," David said, without hesitation and without making it a larger statement than it needed to be, just a fact, a settled thing, the way he always spoke about what they had together. Emma wrote to Clara that evening. Clara's response, when it came, confirmed what Emma had suspected, and Emma spent several evenings with the accounts, and then had a long, detailed conversation with David that was part financial planning and part something else. Something about what it meant to be a family in the broader sense. Not just the household on the ranch, but the people connected to it by love and history. They arranged a loan to William from the ranch's reserve fund, at no interest, with a repayment schedule that was realistic rather than optimistic. Emma drew up the arrangement with the same care she brought to all financial documents, not because she doubted her sister, but because clear documentation protected everyone. She included a detailed accounting framework that William could use to track his business recovery, based on the same principles she had applied at the ranch, adapted for his different kind of operation. Clara wrote back a letter that was not short and not strained. David read it at the kitchen table while Thomas climbed on the chair beside him with the focus of a child conducting important research. And when he finished, he looked at Emma across the table with Catherine in her lap and said, "She thanks you. But she also thanks you for having a husband who treats family as something worth the resource." Emma held his gaze. "You didn't hesitate," she said. "Of course not," he said simply. Thomas, apparently deciding this moment required his contribution, said, "Papa, can I have a horse?" Which redirected the conversation entirely to the particular negotiations of a 4-year-old, with very specific equine aspirations. And David's expression as he conducted this negotiation with Thomas with complete seriousness was one that Emma stored alongside all the other moments she had been collecting since a Tuesday morning in April 1884, when she had stepped off a stagecoach and found a serious-faced man with dark eyes who didn't smile easily, and turned out to be the most important person she would ever meet. By the fall of 1889, William's business was stabilizing, and Clara sent news that they were considering a move west, that Kansas City had grown large and impersonal, and William was thinking about a different kind of enterprise, something closer to the land. Emma wrote back describing the county, the surrounding areas, the opportunities that existed for someone with William's mercantile background and willingness to work hard in a community that was still being built. She described it with the honest enthusiasm of someone who had been converted by the place itself into a genuine believer in what the West, at its best, actually was. The winter of 1889 to 1890 was the mildest in 5 years, which the cattle appreciated and Emma documented carefully, because it changed the pattern of expenditure and resource use in ways that needed to be reflected accurately in the following year's planning. Thomas was 4 years old and had been given a small, steady pony that he rode with an intensity that David watched with visible pleasure, and Catherine was nearly 2 and had discovered that "no" was a word with considerable power, which she deployed with the enthusiasm of a scientist testing a new instrument. Pete Calloway came to dinner one Sunday with a young woman named Helen, who was the schoolteacher in the small town of Willowbrook 5 miles east, and had the particular quality of someone who is entirely comfortable being exactly who they are, which Emma recognized and liked immediately. Pete, who was 27 now and had grown from the wide-eyed young wrangler she had first met into a steady, thoughtful man with a modest but real piece of land and plans for something larger, sat beside Helen with the slightly stunned expression of someone who still found it mildly incredible that this particular person had agreed to share Sunday dinners with him. Emma noted this and noted Helen's equally fond if less visibly stunned regard for Pete, and she said nothing about any of it until they were leaving, at which point she squeezed Helen's hand at the door and said quietly, "He's a good man. He worked for it." Helen had looked at her with clear eyes and said, "I know. He told me about you, about the account book." Emma had felt something warm and full in her chest, and had not been able to entirely identify it as anything other than the satisfaction of having done something small and right a long time ago that had turned out to matter. Tom Briggs retired in the spring of 1890, or rather he stopped being the foreman and started being the person who was always around and always helpful without holding any official title, which was a distinction that seemed to satisfy everyone involved. His replacement as foreman was a man named Daniel Cross, who came with excellent references from a ranch in Wyoming, and turned out to be exactly as good as his references suggested, which Emma noted in the accounts with the pleased efficiency of someone who appreciated when a hiring decision was straightforwardly correct. Clara and William arrived in Larimer County in July of 1890 with their 3 daughters and a wagon full of the specific chaos of a family in transition, and the ranch absorbed them for 2 weeks while they found their footing and identified a property in Willowbrook that suited William's plans for a general store of the kind the growing town needed. Emma and Clara sat on the porch in the evenings while the children of both families created elaborate negotiations in the yard and talked in the way of sisters who have been too far apart for too long, with the particular quality of intimacy that comes from catching up on years rather than days. "You're happy," Clara said one evening, not as a question. "Completely," Emma said. "He's not what I imagined," Clara said, meaning David, whom she had been observing with the interested attention of an older sibling. "I expected someone more." "Warm," Emma supplied. "Yes," Clara said. "He is warm," Emma said. "He is not demonstrative. Those are different things." Clara considered this, watching David across the yard where he was crouched beside Thomas, demonstrating something about the pony's bridle with the focused patience he brought to anything that mattered. "You're right," she said. "I see it now. He has never made a single decision in 6 years that didn't consider how it would affect me," Emma said quietly. "Not one. He argues with me when he thinks I'm wrong, which I respect. He changes his mind when I'm right, which I respect more. He shows up for everything that matters." She was quiet for a moment. "That is warmth. It just doesn't announce itself." Clara had nothing to say to that for a moment. Then she said, "William announces himself constantly." This was said with such thorough affection that Emma laughed. "Yes," Emma said, "you two are perfectly matched." The summer of 1890 had an additional grace note that Emma had not planned for. She had been thinking, for several months, about the educational arrangement she had maintained with the Hands, and about Helen at the Willowbrook School, and about the broader fact that the county's resources for practical adult education were thin. She had talked to David about it one evening with the careful way she approached things that were important to her but that she had not yet fully thought through. David had listened in his particular way, and then he had said, "What would you need?" Emma had told him. Space, some materials, a reliable schedule. A way to make it accessible to people who worked during the days. Nothing large or complicated, but something consistent. "The old equipment shed we cleared last spring," David said. "It's dry and there's room. Martha would help." He paused. "So would I for the practical side of it." Emma had looked at him for a moment. "You would sit in an evening class," she said carefully. "I would help you build one," he said. "And if you needed someone to demonstrate how to read a cattle ledger or calculate a feeding schedule, I know something about that." Emma had felt the familiar warmth that was both the romantic feeling and the deeper thing, the thing about being truly seen by another person. "Yes," she said. "All right." The small evening school ran twice a week through the fall and winter of 1890, with attendance that started modest and grew, because word traveled in a county community. Emma ran the reading and writing sessions. David ran the practical arithmetic applications. Helen came once a week from Willowbrook. Pete Calloway came as a student for the more advanced accounting sessions, and as a kind of living example of what the practical financial knowledge could produce for someone who applied it. It was not large, and it was not formal, and it did not solve every problem in Larimer County. But it was real, and the people who came to it were changed in small, lasting ways by the fact of having come. Emma thought about this one evening after the last of the students had left, and she was banking the stove while David straightened chairs with the matter-of-fact efficiency that was so entirely himself. "Thank you," she said. He looked up from a chair. "For what?" "For making this possible. For believing it was worth doing." He held her gaze across the small, warm room. "Everything you do is worth doing," he said, with the plain certainty that was his particular expression of love. "I have never once thought otherwise." Emma crossed the room to him, and when she reached him she put her hand against his face and looked at him in the lamplight of the shed that had become something better than it was, and he put his arm around her and pulled her close in the unhurried way of someone who is exactly where they are supposed to be. "I want another child," she said quietly against his shoulder. She felt the movement of his breath change. "Emma, I know Thomas and Catherine are enough," she said. "I know we have everything. I just—" She stopped. He was quiet for a moment, then he pressed his lips to her hair. "I want one too," he said. "I have for a while, I just wasn't sure how to say it." She laughed softly. "After 6 years," she said, "you still struggle with that." "Some things I struggle with," he agreed. "This is apparently one of them, but you always know anyway." "I always know," she confirmed, which was true and would remain true, she thought, for the rest of everything. Their third child was born in September of 1891, a boy they named James Arthur Sutton, Arthur for David's father, and he had Emma's coloring and David's disposition, and the particular quality of the youngest of 3 children, which was an entirely distinct personality formed in the pressure and affection of siblings who had already figured out the world and were willing to share their findings. Thomas, 6 years old and deeply authoritative on most subjects, examined his new brother with the same seriousness he had once applied to Catherine and announced, "He looks better than Catherine did." Catherine, 3, did not appreciate this assessment and said so with considerable volume. Emma, sitting up in bed with the baby, had to press her face against his small head to hide her laughter. David, sitting on the bed edge with the expression of a man who could not quite believe the specific shape of his own good fortune, reached over and tucked a piece of hair back from Emma's face, with a gentleness that had not diminished in the 6 years since that summer evening on the porch. "3," he said. "3," she agreed. "We are going to need a larger kitchen table," he said. "We are going to need a larger kitchen table," Emma confirmed. He built one that winter, a fact Emma considered characteristic and perfect. The years turned. William's General Store in Willowbrook became a going concern and then a prosperous one, and Clara and William became a genuine part of the county community in the way that people who are willing to work and stay become. Pete and Helen Calloway were married in the spring of 1892, and their ranch grew at a pace that reflected both Pete's hard work and the financial framework he had been refining for 7 years. Tom Briggs, retired in name if not in practice, remained a fixture at the Sutton Ranch with the comfortable certainty of someone who had earned his place there decades ago and would keep it as long as he chose. Emma's twice-weekly school had evolved by 1893 into something more permanent, occupying the shed full-time and drawing students from 3 different communities within riding distance. Helen taught there 3 days a week. A young man from Fort Collins named Robert Avery, who had come to the county to teach and found the county school already filled, taught there the other 2. Emma managed the whole thing with the same methodical care she brought to the ranch accounts, which were by now so thoroughly organized and so thoroughly healthy that she spent less time on them than she once had, though she reviewed them with the same attention. She was 35 in 1893, and she thought sometimes about the woman who had stepped off a stagecoach in Fort Collins 9 years earlier with a single bag and a letter of employment, and an expression that was doing the work of composure because she was more uncertain than she wanted to admit. She felt that woman as a real thing, a specific person she had been and was still connected to, and she was grateful to her for the stubbornness and the practicality and the willingness to go somewhere unknown and do the work. She said something like this to David one evening in October, on the porch in the early autumn cool, the mountains showing the first high snow of the season, the ranch settled and quiet around them. "Do you ever think about the morning you met me?" she asked. He considered. "At the stage stop. Yes. You had a single bag," he said, "and you looked at me like you were deciding whether I was going to be a problem." Emma laughed. "I was deciding exactly that." "What was your conclusion?" "That you probably weren't," she said. "That you were going to be something considerably more complicated than a problem." She leaned her head against his shoulder. "I was correct." He put his arm around her. "I thought you were the most capable person who had ever walked off that stage," he said. "I thought that before you said a single word, just from the way you stood." "Practical assessment," Emma said. "Accurate one," he said. "Though I admit the complete picture took some additional time to develop." She turned her face up to look at him. The autumn evening light was very kind and the man beside her was, after 9 years, as familiar as her own heartbeat, and as interesting as the first afternoon in the office when he had handed her a disordered ledger and leaned against the desk with his arms folded and watched to see what she would do. 9 years, she said. 9 years, he agreed. Are you satisfied with how they went? She asked, not because she doubted the answer but because she liked to hear it. He looked at her with everything he was. Not the public face of the Sutton Ranch. Not the gruff, contained rancher who had sent a brief letter to a newspaper advertisement and not expected what came back. The private face, the one that was fully hers, that had been hers since the creek bank in the spring and the June rain in the office and every day and evening and morning since. They are the best 9 years of my life, he said, every single one of them. Emma held his gaze. Even the ones with 3 children and no sleep. Especially those, he said with complete honesty. She laughed and put her hand over his, and they sat on the porch of the ranch that was theirs together, in the quiet Colorado evening, with the mountains going dark against the last of the light, and the sound of Thomas and Catherine and James somewhere inside the house, in the comfortable chaos of children who are home and safe and entirely at ease in their world. The school in the shed sent off its 32nd student the following spring, a young woman named Agnes Whitmore, who had come to the county from Missouri 2 years earlier, barely able to write her own name, and left for a clerical position in Fort Collins with a recommendation from Emma that was warm and precise and entirely merited. Emma watched her go with the particular satisfaction of knowing that a thing you have done has mattered in a specific and traceable way to a specific and real person. David, standing beside her in the ranch yard as Agnes's wagon pulled down the road, said quietly, "Your father would have been proud of you." Emma was still for a moment. Her father had died when she was 18, before she had done any of the things she had done. She had thought about him over the years at particular moments, not with grief anymore but with something warmer, a continuing conversation she had in her own mind with someone she wished could see. "Yes," she said, "I think he would have." David put his hand at the small of her back, the warm, familiar weight of him, and they stood together watching the road until the wagon was out of sight. Then she turned toward the house and he fell into step beside her, and the ranch morning opened up around them, full of work and children and the accumulated rightness of a life built carefully and kept with full attention. Inside, James was at the kitchen table with a piece of paper, drawing something with the concentrated intensity of a 3-year-old who has discovered that marks on paper can mean things. Thomas was somewhere outside with his horse. Catherine was reading on the sitting room floor, a book propped against her knees, already so absorbed that she didn't look up when they came in. Martha was at the stove. She turned when they came in and looked at both of them with her steady, satisfied eyes, and then she turned back to the stove and said, without looking around, "Breakfast is ready. Sit down." They sat down. James showed Emma his drawing, which was, he explained with gravity, a horse and a mountain and also a dog, though the Sutton Ranch had no dog, which was apparently James's unvoiced opinion on a subject he intended to revisit. David, reading the drawing, said, "That's a very good horse," and James said, "I know," with a certainty so entirely his father's that Emma caught David's eye across the table, and they shared the specific, private smile of two people who know exactly what they are seeing. Outside, the Colorado morning was blue and wide, and full of the particular quality of frontier light that Emma had been privately amazed by since her first day. The quality of a sky so large it seems to include everything. That makes the work of living in it feel both very small and very significant. The Sutton Ranch stood in it as it had stood for 30 years, solid and working and shaped by the hands and choices of people who cared about it. The accounts were in order. The land was good. The cattle were healthy. The school in the shed would open again on Tuesday. William and Clara were 3 miles east in a house they had built to last. Pete and Helen Calloway were farming land that had been nothing 5 years ago, and was something now because a young wrangler had asked for help and someone had given it without making it a favor. Tom Briggs, who would be 61 in the fall, was in the barn at this moment with the new foal that had arrived 2 weeks ago, talking to it in the low, patient way he had always talked to horses, which was possibly where David had learned to do the same thing. And Emma Bancroft Sutton, 35 years old, bookkeeper turned partner turned the living center of everything this particular piece of the world had become, sat at the kitchen table in the morning light with her youngest child's drawing in her hands and her husband across from her, and the sound of her daughter reading in the next room. And she was, in the complete and measured and practical sense of the word, exactly where she had always been trying to get to. In a place she had not known to look for until it found her, she looked up at David. He was watching her over his coffee with the steady dark gaze that had been, at various points, assessing and guarded and honest and amused and loving and fully present, and was, this morning, simply all of those things at once, the way it usually was now, the accumulated layers of a man who had been known well for a long time. "What are you thinking?" he asked. Emma set James's drawing carefully on the table. She looked at her husband. She thought about advertisements in newspapers and stagecoach stops and barns and ledgers and creek banks, and June rain and August evenings in Foreman, who underestimated the wrong person and words that rang out over a silent ranch yard like the only true thing anyone had said all morning. "Nobody who disrespects her works on this land." "I'm thinking," Emma said, "that I want to write to Agnes in Fort Collins and find out how she's settling in, and that James needs boots before winter, and that the east pasture fencing is going to need attention before the fall cattle move." She paused. "And that I am very, very glad I answered that advertisement." David Sutton looked at his wife across the kitchen table in the morning light of the Colorado frontier, in the house his father built and the life they had made together out of ledgers and hard seasons and honest words and the particular courage of two private people who had decided to know each other fully. "So am I," he said. And outside, the day opened up around the Sutton Ranch in all its wide, blue, working, beautiful entirety, and everything in it was exactly as it should be.